Right, so what we're looking at today then is the transport through a plant. So we need to consider how water is going to be transported through a plant, but also how sugars, ions, etc. are going to get passed through a plant as well. So what I'd like you to do is pause the video here for me and have a go at just drawing a very simple plant, no more complex than this one, possibly even more simple, and have a go at labelling for me all the major tissues and organs that you can. Okay, so here are some keywords that we need to be thinking about today, and hopefully the four at the top you have managed to identify on your diagram. So xylem and phloem are both within the stem. Okay, and the stem is the main chunk of the plant there, and also the bits that go out to the leaves. And then obviously down here we've got the roots, and on the roots, we can't see them in this diagram, we've got the root hair cells, and water is really important today as well, and we're going to link it in to what you already know about water, the structure of water and how water functions. So how is water transported through a plant, and how are assimilates transported through a plant? And when I say assimilates, I'm meaning sugars, ions, etc. So you're going to describe for me the transport system, explain that system and the function of it, and then why do plants require it, and link it all back to mass transport. Again, surface area to volume ratio, metabolic rates, why do plants need a mass transport system? So we're looking then particularly at this time, we're looking at this top part. So xylem is the tissue that transports water, and we need to think about the cohesion tension theory, and then phloem is the tissue that transports organic substances. So that's things like sucrose, and we need to think about the mass flow hypothesis for the method of translocation. So you can see there's some new words coming through. The use of traces and ringing experiments we're going to look at next time, and we're going to look a bit more at data and how to interpret data next time as well. So the questions I'd like you to answer by the end, so you may do this as you go, or you may decide at the end you want to do it all together. What is the name given to the tissue that transports water? How does the system allow for effective transport of water? What adaptations do plants have to survive in environments with low water levels? Apologies for my terrible spag, that should say do, and there should also be a question mark. What's the name of the tissue that transports sugars, and how does the tissue allow for effective transport of the sugars? So, plants need water. Standard. We all know that, don't we? Okay, water is a fundamental reactant of photosynthesis. Absolutely. So where do we need it? We need it in the leaves. Water retains the structure of plant cells. Remember from osmosis that plant cells don't actually burst or rupture. They become turgid or flaccid when there's too much or too little water because of their cell wall. So therefore that's also the structure of plants. So if you think about cut flowers, for example, if you forget to put water in the jar or the vase, they will start to droop. And then that last part there, the plants obtain water from the ground via the roots. So if they need it for photosynthesis, which happens in the leaves, every single cell in that plant requires some amount of water in it, and yet they only get it from the ground, then there's got to be some transport system to get it from the ground up. So we'll start in the roots, and this is a cross-section of a root, and if you look in a carrot you will see this quite nicely. So we have the root, and surrounding the root then we've got the epidermis, epi being on the outside, dermis being the layer, and we've got the root hair cells coming off there, increasing the surface area. Within here we've got the cortex, and then inside the cortex we've got the endodermis, endo being the internal part, and within that we've got the phloem, which transports all the sugars, and we've got the xylem, which is why if you nibble a carrot round the outside and you get into the middle, that's the part with the most liquid and the most sugar. It tastes really sweet. And here are some microscope images as well, where we've cut smaller roots, and you can see each of these represents a cell, and we can see here the endodermis, and then if we look right in the middle we can make out the xylem here and the phloem around the edge, and a closer look here we've got the xylem looking like the nice little star, and phloem pockets around the edge. And here again is another one labelled for you. So the xylem all there, and then the phloem are these little pockets that we can see with larger cells, and the endodermis being a surrounding layer and the cortex around the outside of that. So how does water enter the roots then, before it even gets to the xylem? So it enters by osmosis, and we make sure that osmosis can happen in a plant by active transport. So we require ATP in order to do this. So active uptake of minerals from the soil ensures that the water potential inside the root is lower. So water then moves from the high water potential in the soil to the lower water potential in the root. Once inside, it goes through the cortex, which is that outer layer, all of the layer here. So the water must get from the cortex before it actually gets past the endodermis and into the xylem itself. And we've got two pathways that you need to be aware of. We've got the symplast or symplastic pathway and the apoplast or apoplastic pathway. And here we can see them both. So the apoplastic pathway then enters through the cell wall. So this is all the cortex, everything here. We've then got the endodermis, and then we go into the xylem here. So the water's entered by osmosis into the cell. It's in the cell wall, and you can see that it enters through the cell wall, and it stays within the cell wall until it reaches this blue bit here, which is known as the Casparian strip. And the Casparian strip is a waterproof strip which forces the water out of the cell wall into the main part of the cell, into the cytoplasm, and then that can come through and into the cells surrounding the xylem and off to the xylem. We've also got the symplastic pathway. I like to think of it as the simple pathway. It's just going to come through the cytoplasm. So it's coming through the cytoplasm from high water potential to low water potential, and it works its way through all of the cells, through these tiny gaps known as plasmodesma, and it then enters into the xylem there. So the apoplastic pathway then, in summary, moves the water through the cell walls, and about 90% of all the water comes through there. It's very effective because it's not going to be affected by water potential because it's going through the cell wall. So there's not going to be all the ions and everything else that's going to be dissolved in the cytoplasm or in the vacuole. So it's got a simple pathway through the cell walls, and it's passive, which is a result of transpiration, and we'll look at that a little bit later. And then we've got the symplastic pathway, so that's moving through the cytoplasm. Obviously only about 10% of the water does this. It moves through from cell to cell through the plasmodesmata, and it enters the next cell along the continuous water potential gradient. Once we get into the xylem then, it then needs to come up through the xylem through the stem, and you can see that we've got holes, tubes that go the whole length of the stem, and when we look, we've got these structures within the tubes. So if we look at what that actually is, we've got these tubes which are essentially lots and lots of dead cells end to end which have then died, so we've got the nice ability to get things through, and then we've got the lignin inside, and the lignin is a waterproof component, which means that the walls are impermeable to water. It'd be no good if we were getting water coming up through these systems and just leaking out into the stem. It needs to be able to get all the way up to the leaves. The living parts die, and then the cell's walls remain, and that forms that space. And the end walls then break down, so we end up with a tube. So we've got these side walls here formed by previous living cells, and all the bits in between have died, which allow these tubes to move water. And how does the water move? Well, we've got capillary action, which essentially is the tension of water being held to the sides of those thin tubes, which helps for the water to be taken up. We've got root pressure, which is caused by the pressure of water coming into the roots and essentially forcing water up through the plant. And then the big one that you need to be very aware of is cohesion tension theory, and that's the idea that water is a polar molecule, so it's got those hydrogen bonds between the oxygen and hydrogens, and that means that they're almost joined together like a chain. I like to think of people holding hands. So if I pull the top one, the rest of the water molecules will follow. So if we have a look at cohesion tension theory then, just having a look at it moving, transpiration is that movement of water from the leaf through the stomata out into the atmosphere, which means that we're losing that water vapour. that pulls or has a pulling effect on the remaining water molecules. So we can see in this circle here we've got our water molecules there, and you can see the dotted lines representing hydrogen bonds between the big oxygen and the smaller hydrogens, and so they end up like a chain, and if we take the top ones then we're going to pull the rest up. And you can see here again a nice closer version. We've got these cell walls with these broken down areas between. Adaptations then, obviously this all works very effectively if the plant loses water from its leaves and has water in the soil to get more water in. There are plants that live in very, very dry places, such as cacti and aloe vera, and they have very different adaptations. So a thick waxy cuticle, the wax being made from lipids, which are waterproof, and so they prevent the water from just leaving. And then we've got stomata in sunken pits, so they're further back. We've got these leaf hairs and a rolled leaf, which means that when the water vapour leaves the stomata, it remains within this area instead of being moved away by the air currents. And so it stays there, which maintains a water potential gradient, which means that we don't have more water leaving there. Okay, so we can have water retained within that plant, and as long as there's water within the plant, it's able to photosynthesize and work effectively. So movement of sugars then, the last little bit, we have what's called sources and sinks. Sources are where the sugar is made, so in the leaves where we make the sucrose, and the sink is where it's going to be used up. So just to have a quick look, this is what phloem looks like. It is a structure again of cells in a tube-like structure, and we've got these things called sieve plates with pores which are going to allow certain things through and certain things not through, and we have these companion cells that run alongside those cells, and if we chopped it across the top we'd see this. So we'd see the main parts there with the sieve plate and the sieve pores and the companion cells running alongside. So translocation, movement of sugars. We start off with the sugars being made and then being transported in. So essentially what we've got here is a companion cell, and this works on a process of co-transport. So the companion cell actively pumps hydrogen ions out. Those hydrogen ions are going to then come back in by diffusion, and as they come back in into the main cell here, we end up with co-transport also pulling in the sucrose, and so we end up with the sucrose coming in to here. The second stage is mass transport. So within the phloem, we do actually have some water molecules. So the sucrose and the water move in. The sucrose will dissolve in the water and that forms a sap. And then that will move by pressure, because we've got a higher hydrostatic pressure here than here. So a high hydrostatic pressure will force that water to move down, or that sap to move down. We've got the water moving up from the roots to the leaves. We've got the sugars moving down from the leaves to the roots. And then to the sink. So the sink is going to be a respiring tissue, and we can see here that we've got the mass transport forced down here, and then we've got water moving by osmosis out into the xylem and out into the companion cells, and then furthermore into the sink cells. So these are respiring cells here, so the sugars that are dissolved in that water move through into the companion cells and move all the way through then into the respiring tissues. So hopefully then you're able to answer these 5 questions. What is the name given to the tissue to transport water? How does it allow for effective transport? What adaptations are there? And then these 2 as well. So how are sugars transported in other organic molecules, and how does that affect the transport through a plant? So thinking again, linking it all back to here, why do they require such a system then? Well, because all the cells are going to need the sugar to respire, to function, to grow, to develop, to produce new cells by mitosis, and then linking it into this mass transport. They don't need a heart, they don't need a pump as such, because they have a relatively low metabolic rate. However, they do require water, they do require glucose, and so they've adapted to have this very vast, massive transport system for water. Have a go at answering those 2 objective questions for me, and if you want to go back through the video at all, then please do. Thank you.